Man, thank God it's the end of the day. I've got a cold beer in the fridge and some leftover pizza with my name on it. Casey had to agree with his coworker. It had been a long day at the plant where they both worked, and he was eager to return home. Of course, unbeknownst to his colleague, Casey had another reason that he was eager to return to his apartment. He patted the beat-up old leather satchel slung over his shoulder, just to make sure that the contents were still inside. As if whatever he had in there was valuable or special. He wasn't even sure what those contents were yet. He was surprised earlier in the day when his boss dropped a box on his desk and said,
"I told you to stop having your mail shipped here. This isn't your personal post office. It's unprofessional."
Upon opening the box, he found the satchel carefully wrapped in tissue paper and surrounded by shredded cotton and straw, like it was headed to a museum. And a note, which indicated it was from his great-grandfather's estate. Once Casey saw his boss's demeaning tone completely faded from his mind. It seemed odd to him to be receiving anything out of the blue like this, considering his great-grandfather lived on the other side of the globe and died before Casey was even born. But he wasn't going to mess with it in the office and draw more ire from his boss. So, he decided to wait until he got home. He was nervous, but also excited. He couldn't wait to open it up and see what was inside. "You got any crazy plans?" Casey's overly friendly coworker was still pestering him. He wished the guy would just shut up and mind his own business, but he knew that he had to at least pretend to be polite. "About as crazy as you, sounds like. Probably an old sci-fi movie. Maybe dress it up with a martini if I'm feeling fancy." Casey's lie was so boring, his coworker would have to leave him alone. His colleague nodded, looking a bit grim. Same old, same old. I guess I'll see you back here tomorrow. Grind and repeat. Hell of a life, huh?" Thunderclap. Thankfully, Casey was spared having to answer by the booming thunder outside. It had been raining all day, and by the sound of it, the storm was only going to get worse. But for the moment, it seemed to have stopped. "Storm's gonna pick back up, huh?" Casey's colleague hardly seemed to want to let him go, probably because it would mean settling into an evening all on his own. Their existence was a lonely one, that was for certain. "Maybe we should just ride it out here for a bit." His colleague was probably right, but no way in hell Casey was going to stay in this dump with him. He'd rather take his chances and risk getting struck by lightning. "I'm gonna make a run for it," Casey murmured, then hoisted the hood of his flimsy plastic rain poncho over his head and headed out. Stepping outside, Casey realized almost immediately that perhaps he should have heeded his colleague's warning more closely. Even though the rain was bay, the sky was sickly green and the wind was howling. He nearly lost his footing on the wet pavement. Casey had been through a lot in his young life, and even so, this storm was unlike any he had ever seen. It was dark, as if it was the middle of the night, even though it was barely 5 p.m. And strangely, the green sky seemed to pulse. He hadn't managed to save up enough money for a car, and it was just short of a mile to the nearest bus stop. If the skies opened up, he would be utterly drenched by the time he arrived, along with his new treasured bag. Crack! Thunder sounded again, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. Looking around, he realized that he was the only person on the road for miles, or so it seemed. He gripped the strap of the satchel backpack tight and wondered if the bus was even running in this downpour. Briefly, Casey thought about whether he should turn around and go back to his place of work to take shelter, wait it out until the storm had passed. He then thought about his annoying coworker and pissy boss, and he trudged along. But before Casey could make it to the end of the block, the inevitable happened. Rain flooded from the clouds in a downpour so severe, he thought for sure he was caught in a hurricane. And then suddenly,
Bang!
The thunder was as loud as a gunshot, and it sounded as if it was in Casey's head. Then something green flashed in front of his eyes. A bolt of lightning? The bolt was a glimmering green and mesmerizingly beautiful. Time seemed to slow for Casey. He knew he should run, go as fast as he can, try to avoid the wrath of the glittering bolt. But somehow, strangely, the force of nature seemed to draw him in. He remained rooted in place, unable to run or cry for help. Hiss! As the lightning bolt connected with his body, it emitted a fiery sizzling sound. Momentarily, Casey's body vibrated energetically, as a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced before left him weak and helpless. And then, Casey collapsed onto the ground. His body pulsated for a few more moments, and then it went still. Slowly, Casey opened his eyes. He blinked, trying to recall what had happened to him, and then remembered the terrible storm and the bolt of green lightning that had struck him directly in the heart. Had he somehow been hit by lightning and survived? If so, he might be the luckiest man in the solar system. He should consider investing in a lottery ticket. Then, his eyes settled on the satchel, now just smoldering flaps of burnt leather. So much for luck. His great-grandfather's bag was nothing more than debris. Casey's mind felt strangely soft, fuzzy. How long had he been out? And where even was he now? As if slowly extracting distant memories from years past, Casey finally recalled that he had been walking to the bus stop from work, along the narrow footpath he traveled daily. Oddly, though, looking around, Casey realized to his surprise and distinct uneasiness that he was certainly not on the familiar footpath. Rather, he appeared to be in an open wilderness space, a meadow of sorts, although unlike any meadow he had ever seen. Looking around, he realized that there were no buildings or any signs of civilization for miles and miles. Where was this? Had he somehow died and gone to heaven? And was this even what heaven looked like? Casey scratched his head. He didn't really think this was happening. He expected that heaven would be a lot more beautiful and a lot less barren than wherever he was currently. But then, where exactly was this? It was then that Casey caught a glimpse of his hand, or rather, the hand that should have been his. Gah! Casey let out a horrified scream. The hand he was staring at mostly did not belong to him at all. Only he was, in fact, staring at the hand that was attached to the body he was occupying. What in God's name? Casey patted himself down, studying his arms, his legs, his abdomen as if examining a clinical specimen. There was no doubt about it. He was alive, and he was in a healthy body. That was the good part. The bad part was that this body was most certainly not his own. This was all terrifying and overwhelming. Thankfully, Casey had always been far more analytical than he was emotional. Quickly, he put together the pieces of what must have happened. Unless he was mistaken, and he didn't think he was, he felt certain he must have been struck directly by lightning and killed. Of course, given that he was still alive but in a different body, he reasoned that he must have transmigrated or passed into a different body after death. He wondered why he hadn't just died and whose body he now was occupying. Not to mention, what was this world that he was now in? How could he survive here or return to the life he once had known? But before Casey could come up with any sort of solid plan for how to move forward, hiss! Casey looked down and saw that he was staring at a giant python. The animal was several feet thick and formidable. And, alarmingly, its scales were the same electric green as the bolt of lightning that had killed him in his previous form. Worse yet, the snake was coming right at Casey, its mouth open, its fangs bared. "Help!" Casey cried, leaping to his feet and waving his arms around wildly in the air. "Someone! Anyone, please! I need help! I'm under attack!" His own frantic words echoed back to him in the still afternoon air. His mind racing, Casey wondered to himself if perhaps he was the only human at all in this world. Maybe it was just him and the python. That's right, Casey remembered, pulling himself back to reality. The python. The snake was coming at him, and fast. He couldn't say why. Perhaps because he had interfered with the laws of the universe. But the serpent was obviously furious with him and would stop at nothing to see him dead. Thinking quickly, Casey picked up a rock and threw it at the snake. But the hard clump of dirt just bounced off the animal's scales, seemingly only serving to make the beast still angrier and more bloodthirsty. Crap! The second time that day, Casey saw his life flash before his eyes. As much as he was not especially thrilled to have died and woken up in a totally different body, the last thing he wanted was to see his life in this new body compromised as well. He looked around frantically, stumbling backward through the tall grasses, searching for an escape, a place to take refuge. And that was when Casey saw the cave. It was only about 100 meters away, and Casey thought he would have time to make it there and take refuge inside before the python could get there. Yes, the beast could always enter the cave, and Casey might be cornered, but that was a risk he was going to have to take. He didn't exactly have options in this particular moment. Casey straightened his spine and then took off running as fast as he could toward the cave. He could hear the snake on his heels, slithering through the grass at an alarmingly fast speed. Casey tried not to think about the snake. Instead, he kept his head up and continued sprinting, breathing heavily, pushing himself to get inside. Casey made it inside the cave and collapsed, breathing heavily. He hadn't considered that it would still take him time to get used to this new body, or that he hadn't formed a plan for what to do to take care of the snake once he was inside the cave. He could see the animal slithering rapidly through the grass, coming toward him. The creature was going to enter the cave, and then Casey was going to be toast. But then, suddenly, crack! Casey watched in horror and awe as the snake suddenly was raised into the air as if by an invisible hand. It began to twist and coil around itself, choking the life out of itself as if that same hand was controlling it from midair. Finally, thud. The snake fell to the ground, lifeless, dead. What the hell had just happened?
You're welcome, my boy, for saving your life. Without my aid, that serpent would have gladly feasted upon your bones for breakfast.
Casey whirled around and saw that he was staring at an elderly man. The fellow was withered, clearly at least 80 years old, and possibly even 100. His face was weathered and sunken, but he stood firmly on his 2 feet, an outstretched hand raised into the air. Casey realized with a feeling of prickling unease that he had taken refuge in this man's cave. Looking around, he could see that within the cave were the makings of what was clearly a home. It also was evident that the man had killed the serpent. But how? The elderly man had not even touched the beast. How? Casey barely managed to form the words. This day was getting more and more confusing by the moment. The elderly man's eyes danced. They were a pale milky blue, and they seemed to be teasing Casey, or at least proposing a joke that Casey was not in on.
Why, I did it with magic, of course. What else could it be?
Casey blinked at the man, who was obviously pulling his leg. But studying the man's face, it was clear that this person was deadly serious. Magic? But what kind of magic? How could that even be real?
My boy, look around you. None of this is real, yet all of it is tangible. That is the paradox of this world, you see.
Casey had no idea what this strange man was talking about. How could magic possibly exist? Yet he had seen what the man had done to the serpent, and the man's powers seemed undeniable. Looking around the cave, Casey also realized that his surroundings were unusual, to say the least. The cave was filled with jars upon jars of liquid. One had a golden snake swimming within a multicolored substance. Another was the same electric green as the lightning bolt and the snake. Casey couldn't explain it, especially after this man had so kindly gone to the trouble of saving his life. But for some reason, the jars filled with liquid struck him as oddly sinister. His gut now told him that he should run, get out of the cave before it was too late. But, of course, that didn't make any sense. This elderly man had saved his life. And besides, where else would he go?
My name is Arthur, by the way, the man continued. And I'm delighted that I have saved your life.
Yeah, well, that makes two of us, I guess. Casey was still struggling to process everything that had happened. Now that Arthur had saved him from the serpent, he was ready to get on his way and leave this bizarre man's cave. Anyway, thanks a bunch for, saving me. I probably should be on my way. Let you get back to your day.
Oh, no, I don't think so at all.
Arthur raised a hand in the air and pointed it at Casey's feet. Casey tried to walk out of the cave, but realized that thanks to Arthur's magic, his feet were now firmly rooted to the ground. Arthur smiled faintly.
No, my boy, I don't think you'll be going anywhere. After all, I did you a favor, and now you need to do a favor for me in return.
Casey felt his stomach sinking all the way to the floor. Anything that seemed too good to be true usually was, and this seemed to be proving that point. I'll do my best. I guess it depends on the favor, though, right? The elderly man's eyes glittered.
I'm afraid you don't have a choice. As long as I want you to remain in the cave, you will be bound to me, my boy.
Casey wanted to fight back. But how could he when his feet were literally glued to the ground thanks to the man's magic? He forced himself to swallow his desire to fight, and instead to tap into his even stronger pull towards self-preservation. Okay, fine. Whatever favor you need from me, I'll do it. I just want to get it over with and leave, if you don't mind. Now, Arthur's faint smile bloomed into a full, toothy grin. He reminded Casey of an alligator, armed and poised to attack.
Now that's the spirit, and it's a wonderful favor. I need a human subject for my experiments.